a number of people. I see that we have a number of people coming into the meeting, but I'd like to warmly welcome everyone here today to this session that's being organized by the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. This is a side event that is being organized as part of the Global Partnership for Education, GPE's Global Education Summit. And we're going to be talking specifically today about the best investment, supporting teachers in COVID-19 recovery. My name is Ramya Vivekanandan, and I am a senior education specialist and thematic lead for teaching and learning at the GPE Secretariat based in Washington, DC. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping rules, although I think we're all quite familiar by now with Zoom. Please remember to mute your microphone if you are not speaking. And perhaps for bandwidth reasons as well, you may wish to turn off your video. However, if you are given the floor, please do put on your video and microphone. I would like to also remind everyone that we have interpretation for this event in English, French, and Spanish. So in order to access that, please choose your channel using the globe icon that's at the bottom of your screen. And then finally, I see that people are already using the chat, but please do use that chat space, the chat function, to introduce yourself. I see we have people joining from all over the world. Also to ask questions and to make comments. We hope that we'll have time at the end to get to some of those questions and comments. So just to situate ourselves, as most of you probably know, in exactly 1 week's time, the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, will be holding its replenishment meeting known as the Global Education Summit, which is the culmination of our campaign to raise $5 billion for education over the next 5 years in order to meet the global education goals. Now, I believe that those of us who are here today believe in the key role the teachers play in meeting those goals. And so I'm very, very excited today to be moderating this event, which will begin first with a presentation of new research by the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030, which will include estimations on teacher shortages and the costs needed to support teachers in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. And then after that, I am joined by an incredible group of panelists who will discuss challenges and promising practices on how to create space in domestic budgets and to leverage international funds to support quality teaching and learning. It is my honor and my pleasure to introduce our panelists who have joined us here today and to thank them for making the time for being here. Her Excellency, Dr. Umaria Valentine, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Excellency, the Honorable Minister of Education of the Republic of Rwanda. His Excellency, Mr. Ricardo Cuenca, Honorable Minister of Education of the Republic of Peru. We have regrets from His Excellency, Mr. Malam Adamu, the Minister of Education of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, who I believe was unable to join us today, but maybe will be able to join, we shall see. Then we're very honored to have also Monsieur Abba Babo, who is a refugee teacher from the Central African Republic who is teaching in Chad. And his participation today is supported by UNHCR. We also have Cindy Leafland from the Center for Continuing Training of the Ministry of Education, Science, and Culture of Suriname. She is also an Organization of American States Inter-American Teacher Education Network teacher leader. We're also joined today by Mr. Dennis Signolo, the Chief Regional Coordinator for Africa for Education International. And of course, Dennis is a longstanding friend of the Teacher Task Force. We then have Aminta Navarro, representing the Global Campaign for Education, one of GPE's largest civil society partners. And then certainly last but not least, we have Gerd Hanne Fossen, who is Education Policy Director from Norway's NORAD, and also co-chair of the Teacher Task Force. So welcome to all of you. We're so excited to have you, as well as to I currently see 185 participants. So really excited to kick off this discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Carlos Vargas Tamés, the Chief of UNESCO's Section for Teacher Development and Head of the Secretariat for the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030, to present the new research findings and the call for greater investment in teachers. So Carlos, please, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ramia, and thank you very much to all participants. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you might be joining us from. I would like to start. Maybe I can ask my colleagues to put up the presentation. So first of all, to give you all a couple of updates on some new research and projections that we have been working on in a call for greater investment. But before that, let me just thank again the Honorable Minister of Education of Peru and of Rwanda, our fellow panelists, civil society organizations, Education International, NORAD, and of course, all of the TTF partners and the general public. As I was saying, this year, the Teacher Task Force is calling for greater investment in teachers and teaching. We believe that without higher and more equitable spending, there will be no recovery from this current education crisis. I will briefly present today some of the findings from our advocacy brief, which is released today, which looks at sub-Saharan Africa as an example, and also because it's one of the regions with the greatest educational needs. We will see in particular the acute teacher shortages the region is facing, as well as some of the funding needs. So if we may go to the next slide, please. As you will see, there are different causes driving the teacher shortages, and it's imperative to get to know what are the root causes so that we can not only understand where they're coming from, but actually address them in a holistic fashion. So demand has been it has been driven particularly by demographic factors. As we know, there is a growing youth population coupled with very successful enrollment drives in the past decade. So that has basically raised the demand for education services. Of course, in the past 20 years, the secondary education becoming compulsory has also driven the need for more teachers. However, the working conditions of teachers remain poor, as well as the wages remain low. In some countries, there are also stress levels that have risen, and teachers view their occupational status as declining. Many feel unable to deal with current workloads, lack support, and ultimately leave the profession. The issue of security and safety from violent context on the one hand, but also from sanitary conditions due to the COVID-19 has exacerbated these traits. Now, in addition to this, teachers don't usually receive sufficient initial and continuing professional development. In many countries, teachers training institutions lack the capacity to prepare adequate numbers of qualified teachers. As we will see in a few minutes, many low-income countries face fiscal pressures to cover salary costs and the cost of initial teacher education and continuing professional development. The share of education budget that goes into teacher salaries is very high. We will see some figures, almost 99% in certain countries, which leaves very little room for the professional development, improving the working conditions, and associated support that teachers need, and that the COVID-19 has revealed that is necessary precisely to recover from the crisis. Now, this and many of the above factors may be exacerbated by the COVID-19, which is going to put teachers and education budgets under additional strain. In the following slide, you will be able to see one critical factor, which is that of qualified teachers. The teacher professional development and qualification is a critical factor, as you know, in ensuring the quality of teachers and teaching and the outcomes in terms of learning. But in both primary and secondary education, the percentage of teachers with the minimum required qualification in the region has decreased rather dramatically in the last 2 decades. In the year 2000, an average of 84% of primary teachers have minimum requirements in terms of qualification. And in 2019, it was only 65%, just under 2/3 of primary teachers had minimum qualifications to teach. And in terms of secondary education, the data was even more scarce, but the story more dramatic. There's an average of 79% of secondary teachers in sub-Saharan Africa that had the minimum required qualification back in 2005, but today it's fallen 30 percentage points. So that means only 50%, half of the teachers teaching on secondary level, are actually qualified to teach at such level. The following graph will show you also some of the concerns that have to do with quality. As you know, pupil trained teacher ratios are too high, and they have deteriorated over the same period. In primary education, there are now nearly 60 pupils per trained teacher, so crowded classrooms or Zoom rooms. And in secondary education, we see the same negative trend. The ratio has decreased from 35 pupils per trained secondary teacher in 2005 to 43 to 1 in 2016. This means less pupils having access to trained teachers and more strain on the system to provide quality education, and of course, a particular expertise that's needed for managing classrooms that have diverse levels of needs due to the overcrowding of students. And teacher shortages are persistent, as you can see in this particular graph. New projections reveal that the countries in the region will need to recruit 15 million teachers to meet the Education 2030 goals. That means 6.1 million at primary level and almost 9 million at secondary level. It is estimated that countries will need to recruit 8.7 million new teaching posts and replace another 6.3 million teachers who have left the profession who will have left the profession by 2030. Now, the failure to meet these needs jeopardizes governments and their ability and the partners to recover from the pandemic, to provide remedial learning, to help tackle the learning crisis, which existed way before the pandemic arrived. In the following slide, you will see some of the costs. A substantial share, as we said, of education expenditure, at least in primary education, is allocated to staff salaries, with teachers making up the greatest share. As the figures show, from 28 countries, 13 allocate more than 90% of education expenditure to salaries in primary education. But even if salary costs make up the largest part of the pie is very small. And we find that in general, the teacher wages in the region are poor. So low salaries lead to further attrition, with teachers dropping out or having to look for other means of employment, as we have seen during the pandemic as well, that contractual situations have been fragile and employment not necessarily secured. And beyond the large combined wage bill, the remaining expenditure on education are low, underlining the need for partners and the international community to support teachers. There's an example in the following slide that I think illustrates the point. That is the case of Burkina Faso. It illustrates the budgetary pressures on countries and how essential international aid is in helping countries train teachers to support learning. Burkina Faso has developed and costed a national teacher strategy for a 5-year period running from 2021 to 2025 as part of the Norwegian Teacher Initiative, which is supported by NORAD and coordinated by UNESCO. And we've seen that the overall cost of the national strategy is estimated at $4.6 billion over the next 5 years. So that is the kind of cost that a policy might be necessary for. And even with this, about a 3% only is allocated to non-salary costs, which include teacher professional development, support, and so on. So that is to say, $133 million will cover teacher professional development for the 5-year period, but the country itself has estimated that a funding gap of some $97 million for the period is still present. Without international aid and the support of development partners, these critical training and governance needs will not be met. And then in the following slide, and that will be my final because I know the Minister of Peru needs to leave us soon. So just to say that in light of this, we are launching today a call for governments, donors, and partners to increase domestic and international funding, because greater strategic and targeted domestic and international financial investments are needed to ensure that there is a sufficient number of qualified teachers to reach all learners, in particular those who are in marginalized and disadvantaged areas where teacher shortages are more acute, like is the case of Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. To develop holistic teacher policies and to cost them properly, especially in the countries with the more severe shortages. Comprehensive national teacher policies which cover all dimensions from professional development to recruitment to decent working conditions, career progression, and continuing education are key to creating a well-trained and supported teaching workforce to sustain learning. Then the third point is to invest in teacher capacity and autonomy. Investing in the transformation of the teaching profession is vital to ensure innovation, creativity, and sustainability. Given the lessons that we have learned from the COVID crisis, this can be fostered by building teacher capacities, strengthening their leadership and their autonomy, and of course, involving teachers in educational decision-making, including social dialogue. And fourthly, to invest in data and information systems to ensure that the investments in the teaching workforce are made and that it's proven that they are effective, that they basically have the intended effects. And this is, of course, only possible with teacher management systems, some of which have to do with governance, with the payroll systems, with geospatial analysis, and other systems which identify where teachers are needed most and the need for greatest support. So in conclusion, for education systems to transform in the post-pandemic period, significant investment in strengthening the teaching professions are needed, with an emphasis on equity. More teachers must be hired and education systems must be enabled to provide teachers with comprehensive preparation and support. Thank you very much for your attention. We really look forward to hearing from the minister and the ministers and the participants in this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for presenting these new findings and for this call for investment. We're very excited to support this for the obvious reasons. So then without further ado, we're going to turn to the panel section of this event. And we're going to hear first from the Minister of Peru, who will unfortunately need to leave us at 1:30. Honorable Minister Peru has led a massive campaign, from what I understand, to support rural teachers in particular who serve disadvantaged communities. I would like to ask you, what are the financial implications of these interventions? And how is your country ensuring that the necessary resources are available? Honorable Minister, you have 5 minutes.
Muy buenos días con todos, con todas. Es un enorme placer.
Good afternoon. It's a huge pleasure to be with you this morning for us and the afternoon for others, and to be with you on this critical issue, which is the work of teachers and investing in teachers. And may I say very briefly that we are members of the transitional government of Peru, and some 8 months ago we began, and we'll be leaving office in 4 days, and we began with a process of social and economic development to show that old inequalities in education had been exacerbated, and so we decided to provide much more support for teachers in rural areas as a consequence, in addition to the structural problems mentioned by Mr. Vargas in his presentation on teacher issues around the world, and we have similar problems in Latin America for sure. There are 2 situations very complicated situations which had developed, but they were also an opportunity, which I'll talk about in due course. And then the decision taken was to reactivate teaching centers in the rural areas, because it's the rural teachers who were facing the biggest problems because of the pandemic, because of the structural conditions they were facing. And so 5 decisions were taken, a set of decisions. And then the question was funding them. The first was to change all of the rules governing education vis-a-vis teachers, working hours, working conditions, and so on. Thereby, the state would be closer to the teacher in supporting the teacher in this new process, in overcoming the barriers of remote education, for example. The second was an active campaign for training of rural teachers with courses ranging from digital skills. Many of them didn't have the skills to deal with this. And of course, new forms of developing learning of students and of teaching. But another crucial aspect was psychological support for students in school in order to bring them all together. The third element was a decision which we call closing the digital divide, or bridging the digital divide using tablets in rural areas and paying for internet connections so that they would have connectivity through their cell phones, and priority areas as well would benefit from this. And we opened up a course of action for psychological support for teachers and students, and some 5,000 calls were received by us during this first part of the year. And Peru officially begins the school cycle in March, but because of this complicated pandemic situation, we actually began more around the summer holiday period. And then vaccinations for rural areas in order to accelerate return to the classroom, thereby dealing with the main problem regarding return to schools, that is overcoming fear, so that they felt safe going back to the classroom. And lastly, you ask, how did we do this? Well, how was it possible? Well, firstly, we had to generate a budget. We increased the teacher budget in rural areas by 2.6-fold in order to carry this rural learning process forward. And the second was that this decision involved specific proposals from the Economy and Finance Ministry. Very often they ask for very specific details so that they can provide a budget. And of course, the idea was to overcome educational inequalities. And if we could support rural teachers, then if we don't give the necessary support, the divide would get wider. And then there's the question of the political decision of prioritizing with certain things left by the wayside, if we are to prioritize the real needs. So the positive aspect is that, as Carlos Valga said, this dreadful situation experienced by the world because of the pandemic for educational systems and rural teachers has generated an opportunity for us to bring back into the discussion sphere of the autonomy of teachers, because there was a situation of dependency, and it was urgent to overcome this because the autonomy of teachers' work must also be guaranteed. And I'd like to conclude by thanking you very much for this opportunity and say that, as I've already said for many years now, without teachers, there is no possible education. And with inequalities, you can't have quality education. Thank you very much and a good afternoon to you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister, for sharing your experience and these insights with us. So much appreciated to hear a voice from Latin America. And thank you for having made the time to join us today. I would like to now call upon Her Excellency Dr. Umaria Valentine, the Honorable Minister of Education of the Republic of Rwanda. Honorable Minister, Rwanda has recently been investing in continuous professional development and school leadership. Can you tell us a bit more about these investments and why you feel that they're important? And you also have 5 minutes to share your experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator. The efforts are being made for a reformed pre-service teacher training and continuous professional development, including school-based peer learning and career guidance and counseling system at all levels, meaning primary and secondary levels. Moreover, an attention is given through is given to high-level teachers and lecturers' well-being and status through special motivation incentives and promotion of professional standards. Also, the review of teaching methods in teacher training institutions to create mindset shift to adoption of new teaching methods and the readiness to learn with special attention on effective use of teaching learning materials and appropriate methods of teaching is given a particular consideration. Currently, the government of Rwanda has many initiatives and projects to support pre-service teacher training colleges and the demonstration schools affiliated to those teacher training colleges, as well as in-service teachers. Please allow me to elaborate more on the following that has been done. Training lower and upper primary school teachers in English and mathematics, that's one. Second, strengthening school leadership and education systems by training head teachers, deputy head teachers in charge of studies and sector education inspectors in effective school leadership, coaching and mentoring. Third, there is a review of the TTC curriculum to respond to the best practices, students' needs, and Rwandese culture. Fourth, training of TTCs and model school leaders on coaching and mentoring. Fifth, there is development of peer learning methodology documents. Sixth, equipping TTCs, these are the teacher training colleges and model schools, with inclusive and special needs educational materials. And finally, the training model school teachers on digital literacy. You may ask why I feel that these investments are important. These are very important. The government of Rwanda understands and acknowledges the direct impact that the high quality of teacher and school leader competencies and engagement has towards achieving the desired levels of student learning outcomes in Rwanda. The quality and utility value of education depends on the quality and competence and motivation of teaching staff. Therefore, adequate teacher development, management, and motivation continue to address issues affecting the performance of teaching staff. The status of teachers continues to be the focus of Rwandan government development agenda as exposed in the education sector strategic plan. Recently, English has been approved as medium of instruction for lower primary grades. Therefore, there is need for teachers to be trained in English as medium of instruction in those grades, and for school leaders to make sure that they are managing this transition properly. In bid to curb overcrowding and long distances traveled by learners, the government of Rwanda has constructed a big number of classrooms, more than 22,000, followed by massive recruitment of teachers, around 24,000. Some of newly recruited teachers will definitely need trainings on teaching methodology to allow them performing effectively their tasks. Thus, strengthened continuous professional development and management of teachers across all levels of education in Rwanda is one of the priorities of the education sector strategic plan. This continuous professional development is essential in any domain, such as health, education, agriculture, for a number of reasons. These are the changes that happen, things evolve, and CPD creates a platform for peer learning among education practitioners. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. We very much appreciate your sharing your insights with us. I'm now very pleased to turn to Mr. Babo Abba, who is a 34-year-old refugee teacher from the Central African Republic, who arrived in N'Djamena, in Chad, in 2014. Of course, the Central African Republic and Chad are both GPE partner countries. Since his arrival there, he's been actually awarded Best Teacher in 2018. Félicitations pour cela. Monsieur Babo, can you talk to us about the teaching conditions in Chad, where you're working, and how you were affected by the COVID-19 crisis over the past year? And you have 3 minutes, Isabella.
Merci, bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very delighted to participate in this conference. I would like to talk about the situation. We can emphasize 3 points. First of all, the status of teachers. It has been observed that most teachers in Chad are considered as community teachers trained by the masters of the community, not that many who are state trained. And in rural areas, there are, well, you will find that most of teachers are indeed community teachers. The education system in Chad is therefore compromised due to these teachers, because some of these community trained teachers don't have quality training, and some of them, in fact, are even obliged to give up teaching and look for another job. So there is an overall problem related to training of teachers. The problem with these community trained teachers is that they don't have enough training. They have never received enough training, which poses a problem as to the quality of education in Chad. So what happened is that during the COVID-19 crisis, there were successive waves of lockdown, And this had an impact on the community teachers. They had faced problems, and they also faced, and there were material problems as well. And even the students were facing problems. There were problems related to teaching materials. And therefore, in some schools, it was observed that there were no laboratories, there were no documents, whereas we all know that in order to provide quality education, you need documents to be able to prepare the lessons, etc. And this had a direct impact on teachers themselves. Now, as to COVID-19, well, you might know that Chad was very hardly hit amongst the African countries, and this had a direct impact on education. As I said, there were several lockdowns, and these lockdowns had a direct impact on the education system in Chad, particularly in rural areas, because rural areas were the hardest hit by this crisis. As to the teachers, on the teachers' side, the teachers are not very numerous, and therefore this also had a negative impact on the enrollment of girls in schools, because girls only go to school if they have female teachers teaching them, and there is a lack of female teachers in Chad as well, which was an added obstacle.
We are now going to turn to Ms. Cindy Leafland, but just to share with everyone, our interpreters will have to take a momentary break, I think just for 3-4 minutes. So our apologies for that, but Ms. Leafland will be speaking in English. Ms. Leafland, you work with school leaders within the Center for Continuing Training, which is within the Ministry of Education, Science and Culture of Suriname. And you're a strong advocate for teacher voice and autonomy. So turning to you now, Cindy, recent studies have shown us that on a global scale, millions of children are coming out of the classroom without the basic skills. What do you think has been missing in teacher training based on your experience, and what is needed to fix it? You have 3 minutes as well.
Thank you, Ramya. You can hear me well?
Yes, perfectly.
Education must be geared to the needs of society, but in practice, we notice that this mainly applies to the capital cities. There is a call for qualified education in the rural areas because it is noticed that once the child is in the city for further education, it is often difficult to keep up, increasing the chance of dropping out. In order to allow their child to enjoy a better education, many children are placed in the care of family members in the city from an early age. My grandfather was denied coming to school in the city because his mother heard from other families that their children had to work like slaves. To avoid this happening to his children, my grandfather had to move closer to the city. But for him, being disallowed further education meant working for a local company at an early age. This decision cost him his life since he was exposed to asbestos in the workplace. Due to COVID-19 pandemic, the gap between the city and the rural area has widened. The quality of education in the rural area is a multifactorial problem. City teachers have easier access to training to professionalize, and this also had an impact on the way teachers have dealt with distance learning during the closure of the schools. Not all teachers in the rural area are qualified, and if the teacher doesn't master the basic skills, it's unlikely for the students to do so. What we lack are standards for the position of the teachers, which apply to the entire country. The educational institute should be the ones who train the teachers according to the professional profile of a teacher. Within the curriculum for teacher training, there should be more attention for customizing test methods. There should be equal opportunities when administering tests by responding to the perception of all children to create a more authentic learning experience. An example is text analysis. If a text is given about stray dogs, a child from the rural area has no idea of what a stray dog is. All the dogs, they are roam free. There are no fences between the houses. With millions of students coming out of the classroom without the basic skills, it is also evident that millions are coming out with basic skills. That's why modeling could play a big part in teacher training during the practical part. Student teachers should do an internship with those teachers who excel, trendsetters. Just like the thesis supervisors, these model teachers could receive financial compensation for guiding student teachers. This will bridge the gap between new and more experienced teachers and will allow both sides to learn from one another and prepare the new teachers for the job ahead. To break the cycle that we are in right now, teachers who are currently not qualified must be given a certain period depending on their educational background to become qualified. Also, experienced teachers should have access to refreshment courses to be up to date. To be able to implement these changes, we need the support of the government, namely the Ministry of Education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy, Ms. Wheatland. And I'm told that the interpretation is back, so that's excellent. Then turning next to Mr. Dennis Signolo from Education International, or EI. EI, of course, is a strong advocate for teachers. Sorry, my video is off. EI is a strong advocate for teachers and their representative organizations involved in education policy making. And Education International is also one of our main partners here at the Global Partnership. So Dennis, it would be great to hear from you to get your perspectives on whether you think that having greater teacher voices in policymaking can have a positive effect on teacher investments. Dennis, you have 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Ramya. Indeed, you're correct. It can have greater impact in terms of the quality of the policies that are developed by governments, but also ownership as well as relevance of those policies. And that, of course, includes the needs of teachers themselves. If the teachers are involved through social or policy dialogue in the development of education policies, those policies will be able to respond to their specific needs. And that means being able to identify the needs and then budget the resources needed to address the needs. So that's the long and short of it. But I just want to take a few moments just to, first of all, confirm what we've heard from Chad, but also the research presented by the Teacher Task Force. We see the same thing happening globally in many low-income countries in particular. There is what we call deprofessionalization and casualization of the teaching profession. The status is going down. There are more unqualified teachers. So it's a trend which is worrying globally, which we need to arrest, and investing in teachers will help to reverse that trend. And we need to do that as soon as possible. And the second point I want to emphasize is what I've started with, the critical importance of social dialogue. And that means social dialogue which is institutionalized. By that, I mean legislated, with a clear legislated framework for dialogue between teachers and governments. And of course, we should also think about policy dialogue involving other key stakeholders in education. And it must be done in good faith. And then the other important point I want to stress is the need to involve teachers and their unions in the policy-making process right from the beginning. Quite often, teachers are considered implementers of policy only, but they are change agents. So let's identify the problems together with them Let's come up with the policy options together with them. Of course, implementation strategies, monitoring, evaluation. That way, our policies will be successful. And I want to also emphasize the need for governments to invest adequately in education generally and in teachers specifically. It means meeting the internationally agreed funding benchmarks of at least 6% of GDP or at least 20% of the national budget going to education. And one way of increasing those resources, which are inadequate, by the way, it's only 16.8% roughly at the moment, which is not 20%, which is envisaged for low-income countries as a minimum. But one way of unlocking more resources for education is to actually through fair and progressive taxation. So that means growing the size of the budget overall, the cake, in order to ensure that the slice that goes to education or the share that goes to education is adequate. And that way we'll be able to invest in teachers as well. Of course, we need to invest in teacher training, in the recruitment of teachers, both male and female, but particularly female teachers for rural and underserved areas. That is of critical importance. And finally, we need, as governments in particular, to improve the working conditions of teachers so that teachers have conditions, at least salaries, that are no less than those of professionals with similar qualifications in other sectors. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for sharing these crucially important points with us. EI is very much our ally in this campaign. Thank you. Then turning to our last panelist today, we have Ms. Aminta Navarro, who serves on the board for the Global Campaign for Education and is coordinator of the Dakar Honduras Forum Coalition and member of the Latin American Campaign for the Right to Education. So Aminta, the GCE released a joint call with the GPE earlier this year, calling for greater funding for education in general, for which we thank you, of course. But we know that there are still many countries, as highlighted also just by Dennis, which are not meeting their targets for education expenditure, nor for ODA, for official development assistance. Why do you think this is? And what do you think can be done? We look forward to hearing from you for 3 minutes.
Muchísimas gracias y buenos días y buenas tardes.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. Certainly good afternoon to all of the moderators. It's a very important and interesting question. And first of all, I'd like to say that our movement is one which is fighting for guarantees for the right to education and exercise of that right and an inclusive, free, high quality education in all countries. When you look at the research data in one of our countries in Central America, Honduras, it is because many of our countries are not investing in education, and the global campaign is therefore launching this appeal vis-a-vis all countries and governments, be they developed or developing countries, in order to invest more in education. Now, what can we do at the country level, those of us who are developing countries? What can we do to reverse this injustice? We think we can invest more in order to make the most of the taxes paid by companies who benefit from that education. We can also carry out studies and see how we can carry out changes in the payment of debt in order to assign more resources for education in our countries. And it's also important for the developed countries to support our countries through their own educational systems in order to strengthen ours. We know that the pandemic has put on the table a condition of facing education, which we were already facing. We don't have enough recruited teachers or trained teachers. very little recruitment of new teachers is taking place in my country, and yet the population is growing more and more. And that is why we're making this appeal to developing and developed countries alike to invest more in education. We cannot continue having education which produces poor quality results because our teachers are not properly paid, and because, as others have said, because they have to try and supplement their income with revenue from elsewhere. So that is why we're calling for more investment. We also need worthy environments which will prompt teachers to want to go to school, because a school with a demoting environment is the side of the coin which we're facing in our country. So we call for greater investment in education. It's not a case of arguing over resources going in one place or another and just dealing with an immediate crisis. It's a question of political will. As one previous speaker says, it's political resolve. Our governments need to decide, and they need to say, we're going to invest in education. And as a movement, we think it's going to be difficult to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we don't invest in education. It will be difficult for us to talk about development if we're not educating the population, and if we're also not seeing that young children and teenagers deserve to be educated. So that is our appeal. And we need to do it domestically, but also
momento decir que no podemos estar hablando de dignificación docente, de mayor compromiso de los profesores y los docentes, a quien no les podemos pedir ya más de lo que han mostrado con esta pandemia, sobre todo en los sectores rurales, donde nuestros maestros tienen muchas veces que pagar hasta los materiales para que nuestros niños puedan educarse. Tenemos una poca equidad también en cuanto al número de estudiantes que atienden los profesores en nuestros países, ¿verdad? ¿Por qué? Porque no tenemos suficientes maestros contratados y porque también no tenemos una prioridad en la educación. Si la educación no es prioridad en nuestros países y para los países desarrollados, y yo quiero quedarme aquí, entonces siempre vamos a estar hablando de que nos está faltando la financiación. Entonces, si priorizamos, vamos a encontrar los recursos, vamos a hacer todas las estrategias, vamos a hacer los marcos de políticas para una mayor financiación. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Aminta. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. So we have concluded the panel portion of this session, and we're running right on time, actually a couple of minutes early. So that means that we have time for a few questions. And our TTF colleagues have been keeping an eye on the chat. And there's a number of different questions and interesting comments that have come out. We've selected, given the time is limited, and we still have to hear from our closing panelists, we've selected 3 questions, and I would kindly request that all of our panelists, if you're able to do so, turn on your cameras. And these questions aren't necessarily addressed to one or the other of you. So we're just going to kind of leave it open and invite you to come in if you'd like to share your perspectives on any of these. But before I get to the questions, I would just like to also take the time to mention that Rwanda, from which we have the Honorable Minister of Education here with us, of course, will be hosting the TTF 2021 Policy Dialogue Forum in December of this year. So this will be a very exciting opportunity to come together and to continue this conversation. Yeah, sorry about that. So yes, looking forward to the policy dialogue forum at the end of the year. I'm not sure whether that will take place in person or virtually or some combination of the above. But you can certainly keep in touch with our TTF Secretariat colleagues for more information. So we've got 3 questions. First from Gertrude Namiyuburu. Sorry for mispronunciation, and I'm not sure which country you're from, Gertrude, but you've noted that as we think about increasing the investment in teacher education, we should also think about aligning the curriculum, teaching, and assessment if we are to make a difference in the learning outcomes. We should also think about aligning teacher education and schooling. So in fact, this isn't really a question, but it speaks to this issue of alignment, which I think for GPE is very much sort of top of mind as we're working more towards a systems approach and a system transformation approach to education. So would welcome reflections from any of the panelists on the issue of alignment. Then there's a question from James O'Meara from ISET, who's asking, has there been any analysis on the impact of candidate scholarships on expanding access and/or the impact of teacher education funding to promote success for candidates as we create more diverse and equitable teacher pathways involving candidates representing the traditionally unrepresented? So this is really a question about recruitment, diversifying the candidate pool, et cetera, into teacher education. And then finally, a third question is about accountability in spending. How can we increase, or how can we ensure that the question says national budgets are well spent? I suppose this is referring to how can we ensure that national budgets devote adequate resources for teachers specifically. So sorry that it's a bit of a free for all, but any of our panelists who are still with us, I think everyone is here with the exception of the Honorable Minister from Peru. And Carlos, please feel free as well to chime in. We have about 10 minutes to hear any reflections from any of our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Ramya. Maybe I could begin by addressing the question around alignment, and also to highlight some of the issues that we heard in the panel, particularly from the ministers of education of Rwanda and of Peru, but something that was also mentioned by both teachers and EI and the global campaign, which is in order for the alignment of the content, the pedagogies, and the evaluation to happen, we really need to take into consideration that teachers can actually play a role in the development of the curriculum, in the pedagogical judgment for the choice of the pedagogies and the adaptability of the curriculum that needs to be done, and finally how this is assessed. So this issue of coherence is one that requires from the participation and the expert knowledge that teachers have in classroom, in their practice, as they are closer to the realities of the communities. They know about the needs that the learners have. And I think they are the ones that are best placed to actually participate. So I would say that an important point in alignment is also considering the resources that this entails. On the one hand, in terms of professional development, the participation of teachers, and Dennis was mentioning this through social dialogue, but not only, the participation of teachers in the crafting, in the design of the curriculum needs professional development to do so, because it's not something that teachers have been doing often. So in that respect, in terms of professional development, there are costs, there are opportunity costs, there's time that needs to be provided in terms of training, but also in terms of substituting those teachers who are actually receiving training, for example, on curriculum development, and later on, hopefully, who are seconded to the Ministry of Education for curriculum work or to work on assessment and so on. So I think it is important to consider that to be able to claim and to promote the pedagogical judgment of teachers and their implication in the not only in the implementation but in the definition of the curriculum, in the definition of the evaluation, in the construction of the standards. There's an issue of competence and there's an issue of time that needs to be equated. And I think this speaks of that, that 3%, 2%, 1% of educational expenditure after teacher salaries that is really dedicated to this. So we do see a large proportion of funding that needs to go into this professionalization, into these communities of exchange, and into the collegiate work of teachers in developing curriculum and in developing assessment together with the specialist administrators of education. So just to flag that.
Thank you, Carlos. That's very helpful. I see that the Honorable Minister from Rwanda is still with us. So Your Excellency, maybe it would be great to hear from you, particularly in regard to the second question about recruitment. And the question was really asking, how can we recruit more diverse candidates? How can we ensure more equitable pathways into the teaching profession, particularly for those who are traditionally underrepresented, whether that's through scholarships or through other means. Do you have any perspectives on this or any experience to share from the Rwanda context?
Thank you very much for asking that question. I think recruitment of teachers is a tough exercise because yes, we look for those having degrees, but it doesn't mean all those graduates are able to teach or they like teaching profession. And that is a big challenge. We have to, yes, when we recruit someone we see is able to teach, but once he's there, he must keep being trained so that he feels the joy of being a teacher, because being a teacher is something different from other professions. One, you have to like it. Second, you have you need to have that feeling of knowing much more more than what you've learned in school. So in Rwanda, as I said, we recruited so many teachers. It was around September, October, because the whole last year the schools were closed almost because of the pandemic. But during that period, the government adopted to construct more classrooms in order to try to minimize the overcrowding in the classes. So that had to go together with the recruitment of a mass of teachers, which was not easy, because when we sent out the communique so that those who are willing and who qualify to join the teacher's profession, we couldn't get the number we wanted. Still, we had so many graduates out there, but we gave them kind of tests. And when we tested them, we found out that few of them were able to pass that assessment. So we are adopted to include those who didn't go through education program, but who have high performance, like in sciences and the languages. And then we plan to give them the methodology package when they are already on the job. So that is how we did that. But in the future, and that is what I just presented, we reviewed the curricula of that is taught in teacher training colleges, so that we align it with what we teach in the classes today, and so that the graduate from those colleges are able really to teach and to pass that assessment we had given to them. But on top of that, we had a good numbers of teachers who are already in the profession and who need to get more training. So it has to be hand in hand. You recruit someone, but you don't just leave him on his own. You have to go with him along the way so that he can get more trainings and be familiarized to the profession. So that is what I can talk about, but sometimes it is hard to at the beginning to know this will be a good teacher or a bad one. I want also to talk about salaries. And I think in all countries, teachers represent a good number of those who are employed in any country. Sometimes we think we cannot increase the salary of teachers as it should, of course, due to that huge number. But there are other incentives that must be given to the teachers so that they can feel comfortable in their professions. And this is why recently the government adopted to provide scholarships to the teachers who are already in the profession, but who wants to upgrade their levels. So the government keeps paying them when they are on training, but they are also receiving their living allowances so that they can feel comfortable with what they are doing. So the government is increasing the salary 10% each year, but at the same time, we are trying to find other incentives like providing scholarships to them so that they can also progress in their career. So that is what I can talk about around those questions. Over to you, moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. So unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I apologize that we're not able to call back any of the other panelists to reflect on these questions. But I think that the Honorable Minister has actually summarized and touched upon many of the themes that I saw coming out in the chat. There was a lot about particularly issues of teacher status and working conditions. And I know that Dennis and his colleagues of course, have much to share with us in regard to that, but I think we've just simply run out of time today, which just means that we have to do this again, or we have to convene all together in Rwanda, hopefully in the end of the year, hopefully in person, in order to continue this conversation. So without further ado, then, I'm going to call upon Gertane Fossen from NORAD, who is also co-chair of the Teacher Task Force, to share some closing remarks and insights before we finish today. Gertane?
Thank you very much, Ramya, and thank you, everyone. It's very exciting to be part of this meeting today. When the International Teacher Task Force was first initiated some 13 or 14 years ago, it was because at that time, teachers were not yet front and center of the global education agenda. But with increasingly stronger evidence concluding something we all probably already knew, that teachers are the single most important in-school factor for students' well-being and learning, teachers has climbed on the agenda. And I think that this side event today linked to the GP replenishment is one of many testimonies to this. And with COVID-19, the role of teachers has been further highlighted, if you will. We have experienced globally that teachers cannot be replaced. And we have seen the difference between situations in which teachers are well educated, well supported, with a high degree of autonomy, so that they can be flexible and adapt their teaching in difficult circumstances, and situations where this is yet not the case. It is therefore very alarming to me to hear the new policy brief that Carlos presented, that the proportion of qualified teachers in Africa has declined since 2000. And particularly as it is the most disadvantaged and marginalized that are almost always negatively impacted by negative developments, such as this trained teacher pupil ratio or the decline in the qualified teacher cadre. By way of closing, let me just share some points that I will take with me from the webinar today. First of all, the call presented today highlights the importance of developing comprehensive or holistic teacher policies. I think this is key, and how those policies are developed is detrimental to success. Dennis mentioned that that including teacher representatives is important. So inclusive policy development processes in education that also include teacher representatives in the development of the policies are more likely to result in implementation. Teachers are the main implementers, as Dennis pointed out, beyond just policies related directly to teachers, and should therefore be engaged in the development of those policies. Another issue that I'm taking with me is in terms of domestic financing. There is the need to focus both on the share of national budgets that go to education and measures to increase national budgets so that when the share remains the same, the size still grows bigger. And also, it is probably imperative to design budgets such that more funding or proportionally more funding, or however this can be designed, goes to areas with the greatest need, usually areas where the most marginalized students will be and where the conditions for teachers are the most difficult. In relation to international financing, we see increasingly more actors engaged in teaching issues, and teacher components feature in many donor-supported programs. It will therefore be important that these components are better coordinated, that they are evidence-based, and that they are aligned around national policies, and that we all have a systems approach. As donors engage increasingly in teacher issues essential to learning, I think probably it's also important for donors to take on board this holistic approach to teacher issues, recognizing that there isn't one thing that will fix the problem, that it's multifaceted and it requires a systems approach. Probably we could also add that it would be important in recovery packages for COVID-19 that education features and that teachers are included in those packages. Now, last, perhaps on teacher salaries. Teacher salaries are often mentioned. I'm glad to see it's mentioned in the policy brief, and Carlos referenced it, and also the Honorable Minister from Rwanda tackle salaries and other incentives. It still feels sometimes like salaries can be a bit of an elephant in the room that we don't always want to really go in to hear the steps taken by Peru and Rwanda. It gives an indication of what is possible, where there is political will and leadership. So with that, let me just remind us all to share and discuss the call that's being launched by the Teacher Task Force today. And Ramya, back to you, and good luck to GP on its replenishment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gertane. Thank you to the Honorable Minister from Rwanda, as well as Peru, and to all of our distinguished panelists. And thanks so much to the Teacher Task Force, Carlos, Leila, and the team for organizing this great event. I think it's been a really, really interesting session. We got to hear the perspectives of ministers, teachers on the ground, of civil society partners. So really just a great conversation. The Global Education Summit is exactly 1 week away, as Gertane said. So we're counting on all of you to support us in the days to come, to advocate with your governments, with development partners, to increase funding for education, to increase funding for teachers. And so just to close, I don't know if this is going to work with 200 plus people, but you might know that the theme of our conference is raise your hand for education, raise your hand for teachers. So I would actually invite everyone to quickly just turn on their cameras, their video, and to simply raise their hands, or you use the icon on Zoom. And maybe we can get a photo if possible. But really exciting to see so many raised hands and really exciting to have this conversation. And we look forward to continuing as we go further. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can turn on my video.
Thank you.
Thank you anyway.
Thank you very much.
Great to
Thank
see
you
so many
very
raised
much.
hands.
It was such a very nice and informative webinar.
Thank you
so much.
Presenters.